Hey guys, it's Libby and welcome to a special Jane Austen July edition of what I believe is my most popular series here, rating book cover costumes for historical accuracy. Little twist today, we are not just doing the covers, we're going to actually be going inside of the books and looking at illustrations. So my complete works of Jane Austen are an inheritance from my great-grandparents. These particular books were published in the 1930s, but they used illustrations from the 1890s, the illustrations of C.E. and H.M. Brock, a pair of brothers. And these illustrations were the first time, one, that you get full color illustrations for Jane Austen's novels, and also the first time you get an attempt to portray historically accurate Georgian dress and interior design in illustrations for her novels. When Jane Austen's works were originally published in the first 2 decades of the 19th century, illustrations were pretty rare because it's expensive. So you might get like a single frontispiece, but you're not going to get like multiple illustrations throughout the work. And then illustration really becomes more popular in the Victorian era. But the Victorians were either creating like something completely fantastical when they were illustrating the Georgians, or they would just portray Georgian characters in Victorian dress. It is possible that this is what influenced the costume design for the Laurence Olivier Pride and Prejudice, where they set it in the 1930s, sorry, not the 1930s, that honestly would have been better. They set it in the 1830s and everybody looks ridiculous because 1830s clothes were ridiculous. So we're going to be taking a little peek inside each of the 6 novels to see how the Brocks did. If you are worried about spoilers, because I will be showing you scenes that occur in the book, I'm only going to be using illustrations from the first 40% of each novel. So even if you haven't read the books, I think anything I'm going to be discussing is going to be common knowledge. Naturally, we are going to be beginning with the most famous work, Pride and Prejudice, and we're going to take a look at the frontispiece. So for this one, it is Sir William Lucas saying to Mr. Darcy, "Mr. Darcy, you must allow me to present this young lady to you as a very desirable partner." The first thing I wanted to figure out was what time period were the Brocks going for with their illustrations. Because once you hit the beginning of the 19th century, high fashion is changing pretty meaningfully about every 5 years. In the 18th century, it was more like every 10 years. Before that, it was more like every 50 years, but we start getting like 5-year trend cycles with some 1 or 2 year micro trends starting in like the 1790s. So based on what I'm seeing here, it looks like what they've gone for is a late 1790s version of Pride and Prejudice. A lot of modern Jane Austen films go for like the 1805 to 1815 window, which is when most of her books were published. But a lot of her books she actually started writing a decade before they were published. So Pride and Prejudice she started writing in, I think, 1797 or 1798, and it wasn't published until I think it was 1813. So it's not unusual to see it costumed for the early 18 teens, but I actually think like a late 1790s version is probably more accurate to what Jane was thinking of. So we've got 3 characters here, Elizabeth, Sir William, and Mr. Darcy, and not related to the costumes, but can I just say blonde Mr. Darcy? Now I don't think his hair color is mentioned anywhere in the books, but I don't think anyone in this millennium has ever imagined him as having light hair, but it's, you know, go for it. So Elizabeth is wearing a short-sleeved blue overdress over a white, it looks like probably embroidered or possibly beaded at the hem, mid sleeve length, elbow length sleeve, white dress. This is totally appropriate evening wear for the time. Normally we think of like Regency evening wear as having short sleeves, but in the 1790s, it's actually elbow length sleeves are more common than short sleeves. Short sleeves develop once you get into the 19th century. In the 18th century, and so still kind of influencing that transitional period of the mid to late 1790s, they didn't have the same distinction between day wear and evening wear that you get later. They would think of things as undress, half dress, and full dress. So these are different levels of formality, which are not necessarily associated with day events versus evening events. She's also got this big old yellow sash, which I'm going to interpret as being worn asymmetrically, although it's possible that like this bow is, we're meant to understand that it's at the center front, and the perspective of the illustration is just making it, is putting it slightly off to the side. I think it's better to have it asymmetrical because asymmetrically draped overgowns were pretty popular in the late 1790s. I also like these little creases that we are getting in her gloves, showing that they're kind of falling down. Nowadays we think of evening gloves as normally being like very tight and well fitted, but at the beginning of these sort of like full length evening gloves, they didn't fit that great. They were kind of slouchy. And then the last thing to notice is that this Elizabeth has short hair. This was a style that existed. It went under many names. One of them was the coiffure à la Titus, referring to the Roman Emperor Titus, because it sort of looks like his haircut. Now, women did have short hair in the 1790s, but I'm not sure Elizabeth Bennet would have had short hair. It's quite high fashion, and it started as a French political statement. People who were guillotined had their hair cut off first so that their hair didn't get in the way of the guillotining. And royalist sympathizers or other anti-Jacobins, the political party of Maximilien Robespierre that led the terror, would cut their hair short as like a sympathetic, a symbol of support to people who were being executed. So the Titus hairstyle is definitely more common in France than it is in England, and I'm not totally sure Elizabeth is like rah-rah Bourbons. So I probably would have given her longer hair and then dressed it. Sir William looks pretty good. This is standard late 18th century men's formal wear. You're not gonna get the black formal wear until Beau Brummel. He really brought that into fashion. It's hard to say his name. Beau Brummel has really set the standard for men's formal wear up to the present day, with like a well-tailored black jacket over slacks. But here I think we are like right at the beginning of Beau Brummel if we are in 1797. And I don't think Sir William is following the London fashions really strictly. I do think the heel on his shoe is a little bit low. 18th century shoes had a meaningfully stacked heel. We've got the waistcoat, which is cropped at about mid-belly, which is where it should be at the time. Earlier in the 18th century, the waistcoats had sort of longer tails that would go down over the thighs. The only other problem I see other than the shoes is that he's not wearing gloves. Neither Sir William nor Mr. Darcy are wearing gloves, which for an evening event is what you would do because your hands are sweaty and gross. And if you're dancing with people, it's very rude to put your sweaty, gross hands on them. Now, with Mr. Darcy, it's interesting to compare his shoes to Sir William's. He's got a slightly more modern, like, pump shoe. Well, slightly more modern for 1797. So you can kind of see men's shoe development here, which is also women's shoe development. Shoes were pretty unisex up until, let's see, when does shoes bifurcate? I think it's probably like the 1820s and 30s is when you get sexual dimorphism in Western shoes. Someone please write an academic article with that title. It seems like the illustrator couldn't really decide what to do with his trouser length. So this sort of like hitting below the calf, it's like a cropped pant. I don't think ever existed. I'm gonna go look. I'll see if I can find an image of pants at this length. But I think we really went from like knee length to ankle length. And it wasn't a gradual shift. It was a sudden shift. Because it wasn't like the pants were gradually getting longer. Aristocrats had been wearing knee length pants for ever, and it was laborers who were wearing full-length trousers. So it's just that like upper class men started wearing full-length trousers to not be associated with royalism as much. What with the French Revolution? The French Revolution is going to come up a lot when you talk about early or late 18th century fashion. So I think the Brocks tried to split the difference here, and it was not successful. Orange coat. Not historically inaccurate. I'm giving them a fair bit of leeway with the colors, partially because like the particular printing I have may not have been the colors that were originally used. They might have been slightly brightened or muted. Where this orange is just edging into too bright to be achieved with period dyes. And also, I have a hard time imagining Mr. Darcy picking out an orange coat. This just seems out of character for him. And then the last thing is, in his hands, it looks like he's maybe holding a hat, that like sort of admiral looking hat, which was worn by admirals, but I believe was not exclusively worn by admirals in the Navy. You wouldn't just like be at a party holding your hat. If you wore it in, you would have given it to someone. Ye old Regency coat check. Okay, now moving to the next one, which is just the order that I have them stacked in right now. So we're going to do Mansfield Park. And the illustration I'm going to talk about here is based on the sentence, "The harp arrived and she played with the greatest obligingness." So this is an illustration of the two Crawford siblings, Henry and Mary, when our main character, Fanny Price, has gone to visit them at their house nearby to where she lives. So Henry Crawford has an appropriate pant length, not hitting mid-calf. We're going for above the knee here. So he's going for a little bit more of a conservative look. I'm not totally sure when they've decided to set this one. He also has those like pump dress shoes as opposed to the latched 18th century shoes. My main complaint for him is that his waistcoat is too open around sort of the neck. In this time period, waistcoats were buttoning up quite high, and like men really kind of looked like they were being strangled. But what I think is really interesting in this illustration, and like if an intentional choice by the illustrator, then a very interesting choice, which is that Mary is wearing undress, would be the 18th century term, morning wear would be the Regency term. So you do see these sort of like thigh to knee length overdresses worn over a white petticoat. Normally we think of, like in the 19th century, we think of petticoats as undergarments, but it was also perfectly possible to have like a nice petticoat that was meant to show. So these garments did exist, but they were like loungewear. So Mary is kind of in her bathrobe. So we've got these baggy sleeves. We can't see the front, but it's probably like baggier and looser in front because these could potentially be worn without corsetry. And then it opens down the front so it's easy to put on and take off yourself. Would she have actually received her esteemed neighbors in her morning dress? So I just reread the surrounding chapter, and on the initial visit that Fanny and Edmund make, it's not determined what time of day they are visiting, but for subsequent visits it appears to be a morning visit, so it makes sense that Mary is in morning dress. And it wasn't considered indecent to interact with someone in your morning dress. I think it's more appropriate than interacting with someone in your bathrobe nowadays. But it does indicate that there is a friendly intimacy between the two houses. They are visiting each other in the morning. Normally, the better you know someone, the earlier in the day you are permitted to visit them. The earlier in the day it is considered not rude to visit them. So now moving on to Sense and Sensibility. The illustration I picked for this one is captioned, "To take 3,000 pounds from the fortune of their dear little boy would be impoverishing him." So this is the conversation between Fanny and John Dashwood about whether they should give any financial support to John's half-sisters. So Fanny honestly looks great, no notes. This cap and gown combination is something that looks like it's taken right out of the fashion plates for morning or day wear from the late 1790s. She does have these net fingerless gloves or mitts. So it's a little bit hard to tell whether like this cross-hatching is meant to indicate netting. I don't think netting was common for such fine. I don't think you could net finely enough to really make gloves out of them at this point. I think that's an Industrial Revolution thing, but I'm not positive. And this cross-hatching could just be to like indicate, you know, the color being a light gray as opposed to a black. We've got their little boy. I don't think we know his exact age in the book, but he is wearing like a miniature version of men's clothes as opposed to like the unisex child clothes. By the end of the 18th century, the age of breeching for boys, so moving them out of like dresses and into pants, is around 2 or 3. So like based on how old this child looks like maybe 3 or 4. So it's perfectly appropriate for him to be wearing tiny adult clothes. He does have this like kind of big ruff going on, which is like honestly looks kind of Elizabethan to me. Getting sort of fanciful and romantic with children's clothes was not uncommon for this time period. You've got this sort of Rousseauian idealization of childhood, and I can definitely see Fanny Dashwood putting her son in a ridiculous ruff that he hates. John also looks pretty good. He is like 100% monochrome. I don't think this would have happened. Like the stockings, definitely. You would not match your stockings to the rest of your outfit. It is a bit much to have coat, waistcoat, and breeches all matching, but not unheard of. I also think John would probably be wearing something a little bit fancier because some people have done like calculations of how much money would John actually have been losing if he had given any of it to his sisters and stepmother. And like based on the financial information that we get about the Dashwoods, John is actually like by far the richest character in all of Jane Austen's works. He is extremely well-to-do, and I feel like he would be wearing something with like embroidery. Like either he'd be going, if we're going a little bit earlier to like the 18th century, he'd be wearing embroidered clothes, or he'd be wearing something that fits better if we're going for that more 19th century Beau Brummel look. And you know, we wouldn't have these like wrinkles on his arms, wrinkles on his tummy. Okay, now moving on to Emma, handsome, clever, and rich. Let's see what she's wearing. The illustration I picked for this one is captioned, "I planned the match from that hour. Dear Papa, you cannot think that I should leave off matchmaking." So this illustration is a flashback to Emma with the pink cap, plotting the match between her governess, Miss Anne Taylor, and the local vicar, Mr. Weston. So here it looks like we've moved a bit later than the 1790s. This looks more 18-aughts, or maybe very early 18 teens. Actually, no, I'm gonna say like late 18-aughts to early 18 teens because of the hem decoration. So here, unlike the previous ones, we have moved outside and we get to take a look at outerwear. So this is the first time we see a man wearing boots. Boots were outerwear for like most of history. And you would wear like softer, frankly more comfortable shoes inside. So I know like none of the Hollywood actors want to be caught dead in like pump slippers. So boots are very much overrepresented in period films, but this is the first place where we would actually be seeing boots. We can tell it's later because Mr. Weston, who is middle-aged and not super up with fashions, one assumes he doesn't really have the money for it, is wearing longer trousers. And because we're outside, he's got his coat buttoned, but we can still see a little bit of his waistcoat underneath. We normally think of, in the 19th century, of these like really drastic changes in the female silhouette, but the male silhouette also kind of mirrors that, but it's generally less extreme. So like in the 18-aughts, when women's waistline comes all the way up to the boobs, men's waistcoats and jackets get cut a lot higher, not like as high, but a lot higher than they were cut in the 18th century. And in the 1830s, when women have these like very round bell-shaped skirts, Men's jackets also get this like waist emphasizing sort of poof going on to their skirts. So Mr. Weston is wearing appropriate shoes for the scenario. It looks like Emma and Anne are wearing slippers, which like is not a very smart shoe to wear outside. Regency slippers have like way less of a sole than basically any modern shoe you're gonna find. A little bit more sturdy than ballet slippers, but not much. And if you're wearing them on like a country road, they're gonna get absolutely wrecked. And I believe in the text of Emma, not in this scene, but later, we do actually hear about Emma wearing half boots. At some point, she bends down to adjust her boots, I think to let some people have a more private conversation. So yes, Emma is smart enough to wear boots, not slippers, outside. The Brocks were not smart enough to pick up on it. So Anne's got what looks like a Spencer with these little buttons down the front, and she's also wearing a shawl. Emma doesn't have any sort of outerwear on top of her dress, which I would expect. Like if you're going outside, you're gonna be putting a cloak or a Spencer or a shawl on top of your dress. But at least they are both wearing their bonnets. So I say it looks like these illustrations are set a little bit later than the other ones we've seen. We don't have any trains, and the skirts are starting to get a little bit of that A-line shape with frills at the bottom of the petticoat to help hold the skirts out. That's gonna get really extreme in the 1820s. But we're starting to see the beginnings of it, as opposed to those really like soft, drapey, almost figure-hugging muslins of the turn of the century. So now moving on to Persuasion, the only of Jane Austen's works where we have a solid date. The action takes place in 1814. So in this image, Mr. Musgrove is saying to our heroine Anne, "Well done, Miss Anne. Lord bless me, how those little fingers of yours fly about." So we'll start with him. He is an older man. It seems like he doesn't really care about fashion. He just loves his family so much. So he's got the more conservative knee breeches. And I like that we gave him a fun polka dot waistcoat. I believe that Mr. Musgrove would absolutely wear a polka dot waistcoat. Yeah, everything he's wearing, I think, is great. I think this is just like the illustrators ran out of time. He's got a cuff on one sleeve, and the cuff is not depicted on the other sleeve. At least they got it on one, so I know that they know it was supposed to be there. Now Anne, I think she's actually dressed a little bit more fashion forward than you would expect for Anne Elliot in 1814. So we've got a lot of these sort of the beginnings of this romantic kind of medieval or Renaissance influence on dress, as opposed to the neoclassical of earlier in the century. So she's got this sort of like pseudo ruff going around the neckline. She's got these Van Dyke scallops at the waistline, very complex sleeves with an overlay, and then a lot of decoration around the hem. This is something I would expect more for someone who is high fashion in like 1817 as opposed to 1814. And I feel like you could get away with this if it was maybe Elizabeth Elliot, her older sister, who it seems more like she would care about keeping up with the latest fashions. I don't think Anne would be keeping up with the latest fashions. It's possible that her father, who wants her to look nice, bought her this dress, trying to get her to keep up with the times. And then the other thing is she's not wearing gloves. Now, this is an evening event, so she should be wearing gloves, but she is actively playing the piano. I actually don't know if you would take your gloves off to play the piano. If anyone does know this, please let me know. And then finally, Northanger Abbey. I picked this one because this is one I actually have some complaints about. So the caption here is, make haste, cried Mr. Thorpe as he threw open the door. So we've got Mr. Thorpe opening the door, coat on, hat in hand, to call on Catherine Morland, who's staying with Mrs. Allen. So Mr. Thorpe is a younger man and also not respectable, barely gentry, so it makes sense that he's wearing long trousers. I also think it's a good character choice to have him like with his waistcoat not fully buttoned. Or I think actually his waistcoat is the striped garment, and then his frock coat is the green, and then his greatcoat to sort of keep the cold out is the gray. And then Catherine is wearing this very interesting overdress. You can see a little bit of the orange of her gown on underneath. So I think it's meant to be sheer, and it's got these like ties in the back. Now, if you had ties in the back, I would assume that that's like a pinafore. So it's like a work garment. It's basically an apron, and you could have quite fashionable aprons that weren't meant to, like, you know, hold cast iron pots. But I think like having it be sheer and having it have embroidery at the bottom, like that's too fancy for a work garment. And then if it's an overdress, it wouldn't have these ties at the back because you're not going to be taking it on and off. With Mrs. Allen, I think this is mainly a character criticism, you know, a character interpretation criticism, not an actual costuming criticism. I think they made her look frumpier than she would have actually dressed. I think she would have had a fancier bonnet on. My computer ate the end of this video, so I'm re-recording it today, a day which is 98 degrees. So that's it for this Victorian interpretation of Jane Austen characters. I am overall going to give them an A-. There were a couple of things that I think they didn't quite hit, but that's sort of balanced out by some of the like bolder choices that they took, like having Mary be in her morning dress. So thank all of you very much for watching. If you have any questions about this, happy to talk about it in comments and provide additional illustrating examples. See you later.